Welcome, welcome everyone. Thank you so much to everyone who's joining us for Keep Maine Moving Forward, Climate Action in Uncertain Times. And thank you so much for everyone joining us on YouTube as well, watching the recording. I'll just let a few more minutes or moments till we start slowing down the waiting room. We have such a great audience today. And if Nick, you want to go to the next slide.
Sure. Our branded background's not the thing anymore. I thought I would, we'd all have them, but I guess it's just me.
We need to get on that branded background.
You all have cleaner
Um,
rooms than I do too. So,
Great to see everyone. My name is Maggie Summers, and I'm the organizing and program manager at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Today, we're joined by so many incredible advocates who are working on critical climate policies shaping Maine's future. We're really excited to have such a great lineup of speakers who are going to walk us through the key aspects of these initiatives and what they mean for our state. So, our guest speakers include Kathy Breen, the Director of Government Affairs for Maine Conservation Voters, Nick Jansen, the Partnerships Director at MCV, Jack Shapiro, the Climate and Clean Energy Director at the Natural Resources Council of Maine, Jackson Chadwick, who's the Advocacy Director for Maine Youth for Climate Justice, and Sean Mahoney, who is the Vice President and Senior Counsel for Conservation Law Foundation. And we are also joined by the wonderful Nick Lund, who is going to be emceeing with me and running the Q&A session. It's great to have you all. Thank you so much. And we have a very tight agenda today, but a few technical details before we dive in. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. Please send your questions to me as they occur to you. We'll compile them all and ask them at the Q&A session at the end. And please don't wait. Send them whenever they come to you. And if you are having technical difficulties, please message Rainey Schaefer and she'll help you out. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website and on YouTube later this afternoon. You'll all get an email with the recording, as well as a bunch of other resources to help you take action on these shared priorities. And I'll pass it over to Nick.
all right, let's get started. This webinar marks 5 years of collaborative climate change presentations from the groups on the call today and others who've been with us over that time. Some folks here remember the heady days of the climate halftime shows that we did back in 2020. And I am proud to still be here. My beard is a little grayer than it was back then. But it's cool to living in a state that prioritizes climate action so much, like Maine does, and it's cool to be working with a group of collaborative organizations in the environment and public health realm that can all come together and do these things together. But the landscape has changed a little bit just in the past few weeks. And so, for an update about sort of where we are with our climate work and some of the realities we're facing, we're going to turn to someone who's been in the trenches, former Maine State Senator and current Director of Government Affairs for Maine Conservation Voters, Kathy Breen. Take it away, Kathy.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks, Maggie. It's really, really a pleasure to be here with everybody today. I'm going to start out with some doomsaying, and you all probably are aware of some of the things I'm going to say, but I think it bears repeating to really understand the lay of the land in Maine as well as nationally. We have more climate change effects coming our way. And in particular, our climate is going to continue to warm, and we're going to continue to have shorter and shorter winters and much warmer winters, and all the effects that that has on our trees and on our bugs and all of that, and as well as on our recreation economy. Um, And so shorter winters are coming and longer warm seasons. So that's going to affect everything that grows in Maine, including humans. We are going to continue to see sea level rise and coastal flooding as we did in those huge storms last spring. Sea level has in Maine has risen 7.5 inches already since the early 1900s, with the rate nearly doubling in the past 30 years. Coastal flooding has tripled since 2010 in the city of Portland. Even when it's not a huge storm, it's just a high tide and a rain, you're seeing more and more water creeping into the old port in Maine. Our marine ecosystems are really threatened by climate change. The Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming ocean regions in the world. It's causing shifts in marine species, reduced lobster harvests, as we saw in the news this past week. The lobster catch in Maine was the lowest it's been in 5 years, and in disruptions in the food web across the board. We're going to see more tick and mosquito expansion. Warmer temperatures are increasing tick populations, and Lyme disease in Maine is one of the highest in the United States. We're going to have more mosquito-borne illness as well. Human health risks are rising. We're going to have more heat-related illnesses, mental health impacts from climate anxiety, and food insecurity are growing concerns because the temperatures are changing, and that means our entire growing system has changed, and that's all going to have impacts on how we grow agriculture and consume agriculture in our state and in our country. Also, the health risks obviously are across the board, but they also are more risky. They pose a higher risk to folks with chronic medical conditions, people who live in poverty and food insecurity, and folks who live in high heat islands in congested areas. The economic effects, Maine homeowners are facing the second largest insurance rate hike in the US, and this is largely due to increasing storm damage that we've seen in recent years. We have biodiversity risks, we have forest and wildfire risks, and we have agricultural disruptions on the horizon. So, and obviously we have a federal administration right now who is overtly and drastically favoring the fossil fuel industries and moving away from renewable energy across the board. That's the bad news. The good news is in Maine, we still have a pro-climate governor. We have a pro-climate legislature, and we need to make sure that over the next 2 years, all of us are working together to make sure we elect another pro-climate governor and that we keep pro-climate legislators in office. The legislature has term limits, so every 2 years there's significant turnover, and we have to always be vigilant in electing our representatives and senators who are going to support our work to address climate change. There's one bill I just want to highlight called LD1 that is specifically addressing climate resilience right now in the legislature, and it had a bipartisan set of all four leaders of the four caucuses signed on to the bill as co-sponsors. It had it's already had a public hearing and work session. We're tracking it and hoping it comes out of the committee with a unanimous vote next week. So there is some really good things already happening in Maine. We're teeing some things up that you're going to hear about from my colleague, Nick Jansen, and I think I will stop there. And Jack Shapiro, two of them, NRCM, MCV, great bills coming.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And Jack, if you want to take it Take it away.
I do want to take it away. Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Nick. I feel you on the grayer in the beard. You just can't see it today, but it's real come Sunday afternoon. All right, so I'm gonna. My name is Jack Shapiro. As you heard, I'm the Climate and Clean Energy Director at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. And NRCM has been around for more than 65 years, and our mission as an organization is to protect, conserve, and restore Maine's environment. And it has become abundantly clear, as for some of the reasons Kathy pointed out, that we can't really do that work. We can't really sort of honor that legacy unless we address climate change. And so I'm going to talk about a big opportunity that we have this year to do that, and to stabilize electricity costs, to create jobs and economic opportunity, and to reduce our dependence on out-of-state oil and gas by switching to 100% clean electricity by 2040. If you could go to the next slide, please. So, as Kathy mentioned, we are really lucky here in Maine that we have really strong climate and clean energy policies, and we've made a lot of progress in the past few years. And I think it's notable that some of our big tentpole climate and clean energy policies were actually passed during the last Trump administration. So we have a track record of taking action as a state, going where we need to go as a state on protecting ourselves, even when we have administrations at the federal level who may not share those same desires. But we've seen we have really strong emissions reduction and clean energy standards already. Since that time, we've seen about 1,200% growth in solar. Maine is a global leader in heat pump deployment. Switching to electrified heating is a international priority, moving away from fossil fuels, and Maine really, truly is an example of how to do that as quickly as possible. And we have award-winning climate action plans. Maine Won't Wait that first came out in 2020, and then the update that came out this past November, really charting a course across the economy for what we need to do as a state to address climate change. Next slide, please. So even with all of that progress, we are still today paying the costs of our dependence on fossil fuels and of the impacts of climate change, as Kathy mentioned earlier. The number one driver of energy costs in Maine is fossil fuels. If gasoline prices go up, we pay. If heating oil or propane prices go up, we pay. If natural gas prices go up in the region, our electricity bills go up. Because more than half of the regional grid is powered by natural gas, and those costs just get added to our electricity bills. On top of that, climate-linked storms don't just cause direct damage, but they also show up on our utility bills as well. After fossil fuels, the second biggest cost driver that we see on electricity bills in Maine is storm recovery for increasingly frequent and severe storms that are taking out power and requiring these sort of big mobilized responses from the utilities to get power turned back on for people across our state. Next slide, please. But we have a really exciting opportunity to take another big step forward on this year, and that is to accelerate our goal of reaching 100% clean energy by 10 years, from 2050 up to 2040. This is a really big deal, and a lot of work has already been done to lay the groundwork for adopting this policy. The Governor's Energy Office and the Public Utilities Commission and the Maine Climate Council have all been putting forward, working with the stakeholder processes, planning processes, detailed technical analyses, all of which are supporting achieving this 100% by 2040 goal. And that includes a really big assessment of our existing renewable portfolio standard. Last year, Maine Won't Wait, the state's climate action plan includes adopting 100% by 2040. The pathways analysis that the governor's office did was the first ever hour by hour analysis of Maine's energy system going into the future. which showed that we have multiple different ways that we can achieve this goal. And it's also incorporated into Maine's comprehensive energy plan, which came out from the governor's office in January of this year. Next slide. So this bill is still being worked on. It's being sponsored by Senator Mark Lawrence, but I can share some of the big contours of it. And there's really sort of two big pieces. First, the bill boosts Maine's existing renewable portfolio standard to 90% by 2040, up from 80% by 2030. And it creates a new class of clean resources, which will be defined by the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, or Maine DEP, through a rulemaking process. And while we need to be really attentive to make sure those definitions and directions to DEP are strong, we believe this is the best way to reach 100% clean electricity, with all of the benefits that will bring at the lowest reasonable cost. Aside from raising those goals, the bill also is going to create a steady and predictable and regular procurement schedule for these renewable and clean resources. And this is really important because it's going to be an improvement over the individual procurement steps for clean energy Maine has taken in the past, where there's been specific tranches of solar or other resources that have storage, other things that have gone forward. And even as that approach has driven real successes, because some of those past renewables procurements have actually measurably pushed down electricity costs, this is going to institute a more rationalized process and really also improve the quality of bids, since developers won't think they just have one shot to bid in their project. And so we're going to be getting more mature, more well-developed projects that are more likely to reach the finish line and bring us all the benefits that we know come from clean energy. Next slide. So this really is an exciting opportunity to keep Maine moving forward, no matter what's happening at the federal level. And reaching 100% clean electricity by 2040 it's going to result in lower and more stable energy costs for households and businesses, reducing that big volatility of fossil fuels that we've seen so painfully in the past few years. It's going to create good paying jobs and economic opportunity for Maine people. There was just a new analysis showing that more than 15,000 people work in clean energy in Maine, up from just a couple thousand 10 or 15 years ago. And of course, this is the core pathway for reducing emissions and addressing climate change as a state, which we know is already affecting our communities on the coast and inland, and our wildlife and ecosystems, and all kinds of other things as well. So look forward to answering any questions that folks have on 100% by 2040, and hope you'll join us in urging your legislators to support this really important bill. And I will pass it back to you, Maggie.
Thank you so much, Jack. And I'll hand it over to either Jackson or Sean.
Thanks, Maggie. Happy to take over. Hi, everyone. My name is Jackson Chadwick. I'm the Advocacy Director at Maine Youth for Climate Justice. We've been around since 2019, and we advocate across the state to fight for climate justice and a livable future for the youth and young adults of Maine. We are one of the core organizations supporting the Climate Superfund legislation. To summarize Climate Superfund in one sentence, this is a way to make big polluters pay for climate adaptation and storm recovery projects without taxpayers and municipalities having to shoulder the burden of those costs. So the Climate Superfund, just to give you a little bit of background, was kind of inspired by the federal Superfund program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That's the Comprehensive Environmental Response Cleanup and Liability Act of 1980. So that legislation, also known as CERCLA, allows the US government to step in certain situations and respond to environmental disasters, environmental hazards. One common example are toxic chemical spills. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what happens at Love Canal in New York. That's kind of a historic example of the Superfunds coming into action and helping clean up toxic chemical spills. So that's kind of the inspiration behind this. Climate superfunds have now been enacted in a couple of different states. In Vermont, it was enacted a couple of years ago. It has also passed in New York. And this year, it's also being proposed in Massachusetts, Maryland, and Rhode Island. Essentially, how this program would work is it would target some of the biggest polluters out there. We're not talking about local oil or gas companies here in Maine. We're talking about big international companies that have caused such a huge portion of the climate crisis. So essentially, the state would issue cost recovery demands to these polluters that would then pay into a climate superfund account, which could be used to finance climate adaptation and storm recovery costs here in the state. And that's a great thing because we don't believe that municipalities nor taxpayers should have to pay out of pocket for cleaning up after disastrous storms or funding climate adaptation costs. The responsibility should go to the people who caused us to be in the crisis that we're in today. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Sean Mahoney at the Conservation Law Foundation to talk a little bit more about how this legislation would work and some of its legal components. Take it away, Sean.
Thanks, Jackson. So the first thing to note is that the bill has not been printed yet, so we don't have final language. We expect that to come out in the next week or so. It's sponsored by Senator Brenner from Scarborough, and we hope that it's something that we can start working on beginning next week. As Jackson said, the fundamental theory here is polluter pays. So the statute or the legislation here is modeled after the legislation that was enacted in Vermont and New York. Actually, both were just enacted last year. So it's a relatively new approach to how to address not only holding those accountable for the climate crisis, but also creating funds that are going to be necessary for resilience, adaptation, and recovery. So the three key things that will need to be done under the bill will be, the first will be to identify who the responsible parties are. And so responsible parties, we can do that because we have good data going back 20, 25 years on the amount of product that's been imported into Maine, because we don't produce any, or we don't extract any or refine any fossil fuels here in Maine. So those companies that have a nexus with the state and have provided their product here for use, either for gasoline in cars or oil for heating or for industrial use, and leading to climate pollution. So the Maine Department of Environmental Protection under this bill would be responsible for identifying those parties. The next part would be, what are the costs that Maine has incurred and is expected to incur? And as Kathy was saying earlier, with respect to LD1, the bill that is for storm preparedness and storm response, it's a good bill. The EPC is supporting the bill, but it only provides funding for 2 years. And even the funding that it provides for 2 years doesn't come close to meeting the 100 million plus in damages from the 3 winter storms last year, nor does it even address the costs associated with storms that whose costs are passed on to utility customers, for example. So we're talking not millions, we're talking billions. So the New York fund is $75 billion. It was set as a hard number. Vermont is in the process of determining those costs. And the Maine legislation is proposing to follow the Vermont method, and that would be with the Maine State Treasurer determining what the costs are going to be going forward. Once you've determined the costs and the responsible parties, it's a matter of allocating responsibility for those costs to the responsible parties. And that will be another decision. That will also be done under this legislation as proposed by the DEP. The challenges to this are going to be, I think, primarily the typical issues about it's going to cost too much. So I see three challenges. One, agencies may say that they need a lot more staffing in order to do this. We don't think that that's necessary, that there are the information is available already. That said, we're making provision in the legislation to allow the agencies to recover their funds if they need to add staff. The second piece with respect to costs are costs of litigation. The statutes, the laws in Vermont and New York have already been challenged. In Vermont by the trade group for big oil and gas companies, and in New York by red state attorney generals and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. There will be litigation around this. There was litigation around CERCLA when it was enacted and adopted in 1980. But we feel pretty confident that legally the state has every right in the world to enact this statute. And the third argument would be to try and say that this is just going to mean added cost passed on to consumers, which is a pretty hard argument to make. As Jack said, the costs associated with climate and moving to clean and the benefits of moving to clean energy far outweigh any of those costs. And we're talking about companies who had record profits in the billions last year. So we feel that this is a good bill. It is a good complement to the governor's LD1, and we're hopeful that it moves forward. And as Jack was saying, we're hoping that you all will be engaged in reaching out to your representatives to support this once the bill is printed. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sean and Jackson, and I'll hand it over to Nick Jansen.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, Nick. And I'm going to continue on a theme that we've kind of been highlighting today, and that's affordability and who should be paying for things and paying for the cost of a clean energy transition. And to that end, the need for an Energy Fairness Act is really simple. Electricity is a basic need, and electric bills in Maine are really expensive. And we don't think it's fair that corporate shareholders are able to make millions off of the backs of electric ratepayers. So this bill would take a step towards ensuring that everyone has electricity by lowering bills, by facilitating the transition to cleaner and cheaper forms of energy, and by protecting customers from what can currently be pretty harsh disconnection practices. So how are we going to do this? Maggie, if you want to go to the next slide. There's a lot in this bill, and there's a lot of really exciting and innovative pieces of this bill. And the language is still being finalized, like a lot of the other bills we're talking about today. But there's one particular piece that I really want to lift up because there's a real need for it and people are really coalescing around it. And that's around the disconnections piece. So right now, there's under existing law a disconnection ban during the winter months, so people aren't losing their electricity in the winter during the harshest weather, and that's super important, and we're really glad that's in place. And then there's also a medical disconnection ban, and this is geared towards making sure that people who have a medical need for electricity don't lose access to it. But there's, I think, a lot of room for improvement there because the way it works is the ban, it's really kind of more of a pause, only applies for a 3-month period out of the year, and then you have to reapply for it. And, you know, if you think about that for more than about a second, kind of doesn't make sense because medical needs don't just expire on a 3-month schedule and then reappear neatly the next year. So we want to go farther there and ban disconnections for anyone who has a medical need for electricity. So think, needing to refrigerate medication or charge a wheelchair or another medical device. And we also wanted to see it applied to households with children and households with older people in it, because the folks in these homes really shouldn't have to be choosing between their health and paying their electric bill. It's just a totally untenable situation to put people in. And so while this bill would be transformative for some people, we really are seeing it as a first step towards ensuring that everyone has access to electricity. And this is going to be especially important as we continue to decarbonize and rely more than ever on electricity to heat our homes, power our cars, and continue to just meet our daily needs. So that's why it's so important that we set up a system to have electricity that is accessible and affordable. There's several other parts of this bill. As I mentioned, it will also seek to lower electric bills by limiting what utilities can recover from ratepayers. It would adjust billing practices to make sure that low-income folks can take advantage of the benefits of solar energy programs. And there's some really neat labor provisions in here too that would strengthen the rules around registered apprentice programs to ensure that we can have strong labor standards and a well-trained workforce to provide a safe and reliable electric grid. This act has a really broad coalition of advocacy groups behind it. It's also a priority bill for the Environmental Priorities Coalition. If you attended that lunch and learn back in January, you would have heard me speak about that then. Senator Carney from Cape Elizabeth is the sponsor, and she's been really great to work with. And yeah, as I said, still waiting for the bill to be printed and to get a hearing date scheduled. So make sure to stay tuned for that so you can learn more and get involved and help support this really important work. Um, and with that, Maggie, I'll hand things back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. And before we get to the question and answer section, I just wanted to say, obviously, there's a lot more to say about these bills. And later this afternoon, everyone who registered is going to get a follow-up email with resources to take action, key takeaways, more information about the bills, and ways that you can stay involved with all of our groups. But I definitely wanted to give a shout out to our upcoming lobby days, which would be, it would be so incredible to see you there. I'll make sure that we send links to register for the lobby days in the follow-up email. But wanted to say April 3rd is Conservation Lobby Day. The Natural Resources Council of Maine is having their State House Action Day on April 8th, and Youth Day of Action, which Jackson, the Maine Youth for Climate Justice, is helping to put together. So, along with other great things to sign, I wanted to give a shout out to our lobby days. And Nick, we have so many questions to choose from, so I'm really excited for this.
Let's do it. I'm going to stop my sharing so I can read these questions. And there are a lot. So I'm going to start from the top. I hope the panelists are on their toes right now. I'm going to start with Jack Shapiro. There are a number of questions about your clean energy work. I'll start here at the top. In regards to solar, is there any push to start installing solar panels over parking lots or along highways to create bike paths like they're doing in South Korea?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think a couple things I might say about this. So we need a lot of new clean energy to achieve our climate goals, because not only do we need to replace the expensive and volatile fossil fuel generation that we already have, but we also need to provide new resources to help power the widespread adoption of heat pumps, electric vehicles, and other things. And when it comes to solar, it means we need to solar at all different scales. So we need some big utility scale solar developments, because those are incredibly cheap. Solar has come down almost 90% in terms of like installed cost over the last 10 or 15 years. So you get really, really low cost energy there that has almost no operating costs once it's installed. So we need those big ones as well. We also want to have distributed solar around the grid, and that could be on roofs. It could be along bike paths or parking garages, like the question pointed to, because when you generate power in the neighborhood and not sort of at a distant, solar field, it gets used right in that same area, which means you don't have to have a lot of the infrastructure or build additional infrastructure to move that power around. You don't need transmission lines. You don't need to upgrade substations and transformers and things like that. So that has its own whole set of benefits for cost and for reliability and resilience and all of these kinds of things. There is not a specific program that's targeted at those particular like use cases, like a solar bike path or solar parking garages, that I'm aware of. But I will say, on behalf of one of my colleagues who leads our transportation work, one of the things that we're trying to do is get more bike paths installed in the first place here in Maine, because from a climate perspective, we really need a lot more active transportation corridors to help people get around and get to where they need to go, whether that's work or appointments or wherever, without having to get into a car in the first place. Because driving, as much as it represents freedom, is the most expensive, polluting, and dangerous way to get around. So having those alternative transportation options for people wherever we can is really important too.
Thank you, Jack. And I'll add in quickly, from Maine Audubon's perspective, I know in the past couple of years, we've worked with a number of folk groups on this call to incentivize solar in beneficial places, like on top of brownfields or on top of landfills, places that otherwise can't be used for things, but that may be good for solar. And so that sort of relates to your question, is a very active concern in Maine and a place we've made a lot of progress so far. I want to sort of pull it back to a really good question here. This may be for any and all of the panelists here, which is, could one of the speakers explain why, in all caps, why is it that Maine has such high electricity rates? What causes this? I know this is a complicated question, but I think this is a good sort of maybe starting point for folks to understand the various ways, that we're in the position we're in. And so I'll throw it open to anyone who may want to dive in on that one.
I'll start, and I'm happy to kind of have Jack correct me. I think the first thing, yes, what everybody gets in the mail every month with their electricity bill is high, and it's higher than other places in the country. Absolutely. One thing to remember, though, is that electricity bill is broken into two things. It's the cost of the electricity, and it's the cost of transmitting and delivering that electricity. And so when you actually look at the cost of electricity in Maine, it's actually lower than anywhere else in New England. Most of the time, there may be some periods where another state might be a little lower, like Vermont. But for the most part, we're the lowest in New England. And we have a lot when it comes to transmission and delivery costs, because we're a big state, we're a rural state. We have a lot of transmission lines, so the operation and maintenance of those lines are expensive. And they get more expensive as we have more severe storms, and the utilities have to go out and repair, and then they get extra costs, and those get recovered from ratepayers. So it is very expensive on that end. It's also expensive because the price is set largely by natural gas price, and natural gas costs are spiky, and in the Northeast are very high, because most of the natural gas comes from outside the Northeast. So because we're so reliant on natural gas, which sets the kind of electricity price in the New England region, it passes costs on to us. What what is lost in the reality of expensive bills from CMP or Versant is that the clean energy we've been adding over the last decade is actually helping to keep the actual cost of electric generation down because you don't have to pay for the fuel. And there's a complicated way of how energy gets bid in, but the simple thing is that because you don't pay for fuel, solar and hydro and wind will provide energy whenever they have it, and there's a demand for it, and they'll provide it at the lowest cost, as opposed to natural gas, which has to cover their fuel costs. So obviously it's a complicated answer to a very simple question. Why is my bill so high? I think the biggest reason is because the transmission and delivery costs are high in a state like Maine. Absolutely. I think that the second is that we're dependent on natural gas still, and that volatility of natural gas leads to very expensive bills, particularly when there's not enough natural gas to go for heating. So those would be the two pieces that I would say are the highest. What did I
Thank you,
get
Sean.
wrong, Jack?
No, I think like one way to think about it is like Maine doesn't have like a big city. And whenever you have infrastructure, having dense population makes everything cheaper when you spread the cost over everybody, over everything. So we don't have that. And so generally speaking, the grid infrastructure costs are a little bit higher than they would be in a place where you maybe have a utility with a giant urban area in their territory, which helps sort of like bring the average cost of service down for everybody. So that's thing number one. What Sean said about the supply is really right. New England like doesn't have like a fossil energy resource, so everything that we use is imported from somewhere else, and that just makes it in sort of inherently more expensive, even before you get into the fact that like it's subject to these global market swings where Russia invades Ukraine and then Europe wants to buy all of the gas, and then it throws the whole global market into turmoil and all kinds of other things. So, but yeah, those are we have sort of both of those things happening in Maine.
Thank you very much. And I should add too a note from Steve Clemmer, our friend from Union of Concerned Scientists. Another big cost driver is storm-related damage costs fueled by climate change. Remember that was covered by Kathy at the top, and that's important to remember because that's a bit of a wild card here that is increasing over time. If any other panelists want to jump in on that high bills question, now would be the time. Otherwise, I'll jump.
Well, I would just reiterate that the more power we can generate and control in Maine, we will have lower prices over time. We will have more control. So that's why groups like all these here are so interested in solar and offshore wind and renewables that we will produce and transmit right here at home.
Yeah. The last thing I would say, sorry, but the cheapest energy is the energy we don't use. And so the efforts that we all put into energy efficiency are critical to reducing those costs. So both reducing demand and tightening up homes and businesses are critical. And it's another reason why that's been a consistent focus for the group of organizations here today to support the work of the Efficiency Maine Trust and other efforts to reduce the amount we use.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I just had one other thing I wanted to add that I think is really important for everyone to know, which is that one of the the biggest policies that help support the adoption of renewable energy here in Maine is actually federal clean energy tax credits. And those tax credits are being targeted in Congress for repeal in order to open up space for larger tax cuts. And there have actually been a couple of studies now that show this, but the result of that in New England will be higher rates because it will slow our ability to reduce our exposure to natural gas prices. The two places in the country where it will raise rates the most are in the Midwest, where they have a ton of really low cost wind that won't come online, and in New England, where we're just really, really exposed to high natural gas prices. So that debate that's happening in Congress right now about tax cuts and what to get rid of to pay for them, we all need to really make sure that those clean energy tax credits survive, because without that, we're going to continue to see that upward pressure on our electricity rates as well.
So that should be topic number one in your phone call to Senator Collins's office.
Thank you all. This is of central importance here. The price of energy is a major driver for policy in Maine, and also a ripe source of misinformation, right? There's lots of people sort of pointing fingers in different directions, but the folks on this call, I'm happy to spend as much time as we want on this, because this is central to an understanding of why things are the way they are and where we go from here. And so please continue to sort of be in discussions with the folks on this call, listen to the reports and information that folks here put out, because getting a true understanding of what drives costs down or up, and where we can go in the future is really, really important to to this whole debate. So thanks everyone for your comments so far. We have, I can't count them, but I think it's 1 trillion questions. I'm at about 1 trillion. I want to sort of change gears just a little bit to a question here about the Superfund bill. Since Maine is following Vermont and New York's lead on holding polluters accountable, what can we learn, or are we learning from their experiences to strengthen our approach?
It's a great question. And we did, and in helping Senator Brenner come up with the language for this, we did look at both those bills and try and take the best of both. And my colleagues at Conservation Law Foundation were very involved in getting the bill passed in Vermont. So we've got that coordination ongoing. I think one of the things that we're trying to do here that is not in the other bills is to try and anticipate the argument by the agencies that they don't have the resources to do this. And so there's a provision in the bill that would allow each of the agencies to recoup from the fund, once it's established, whatever costs that they've had to incur in executing their responsibilities under that. Neither of the other two states had that ability to fund it. And that may change as the bill gets worked in the legislature, but the idea is so that we don't have a good bill fail because there's a fiscal note that says we need 2 people at the Department of Environmental Protection and there's no money for that. So we'd like to provide that in advance. I think another piece that we wanted to try and tighten up a little bit was the idea that you could bring in the Exxon Mobil's, the Shell oil, the Irving oil into the state. And so how do we make sure that the statute has language that makes it clear that these companies are being identified as responsible parties because they have a very clear nexus on a business basis with the state of Maine and have benefited from that state of Maine over the many decades going forward. So I think that's been helpful. I think the other piece that we've learned is we are with Jackson and Nick and others are reaching out to the parties, to the agencies and the key people before this bill hits the floor, so that they're aware that we're doing it. So, for example, we've had conversation with the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General office has its own lawsuit against the big oil companies for deceptive advertising, essentially, and to recoup costs because of a violation of laws that prohibit that. We think that this Climate Superfund bill is very consistent with that language, and have worked with the AG so that we will hopefully garner the AG's support for this bill. And I think that's an important part of it. So there are both specific language pieces that we've tried to do, as well as how are we rolling this out going forward. I don't know, Jackson, if you wanted to add anything, or anybody, or Kathy wanted to add anything to that, or Nick.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add for some more additional context. I think we all remember the kind of devastating storms Vermont experienced, terrible flooding that happened there. And that was kind of the catalyst for this climate superfund. And this legislation that passed in Vermont passed with bipartisan support. It was not just a solely party line bill. And so one thing we're hoping to kind of replicate that here in Maine and have bipartisan support for this bill and kind of get it across the finish line. Now, that might be a really challenging prospect, but it's something I feel like this group is determined to do. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that in there, that this is kind of a very collaborative, bipartisan effort.
And I would just tack on to that the fact that the Maine AG has already filed a lawsuit, and the fact that legislators are always overwhelmed by the number of bills and information coming at them. What Sean said about differentiating this bill from what the AG is doing is going to be very important in our messaging and helping legislators understand, because it's the easiest thing, even for allies, is to go, well, the AG is already doing this. We don't have to do this. And we have to make sure that they don't default to that, and understand very clearly that they're two separate paths, and they're both valid, and they're both important, and we should do both at the same time.
And on the timing, I think we're actually in a real sweet spot here in Maine, because we will get sort of a sneak peek both into how the sort of agency process plays out in Vermont as they move forward with that. And we're also going to get a sneak peek into some of the litigation arguments and how to craft the most effective response to that. At the same time, it's also really important to move forward with this now, because these are costs we're already starting to incur. I mean, $90 million last winter just to public infrastructure. We're going to have to pay for that if these fossil fuel companies that are responsible for causing this problem in the first place don't. So it's good to see what some other states are doing and be able to learn from them. And it's also really important that we move forward with this as fast as possible.
Awesome. Great answers, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm going to shift back to a clean energy question. I'm going to sort of bundle two together here. With current federal policies to discourage wind, how will we meet our renewable energy standards if ocean wind is no longer reasonable? Also, what can be done to rescue offshore wind as a source of renewable energy?
Thanks, Nick. And you know that I love nothing more than to talk about offshore wind. So you've come to the right place. So I think one, for folks' background, I think this is really important to understand. Because New England does not have fossil energy resources and limited other options for renewable energy generation, the biggest available resource that we have to meet our clean energy goals is offshore wind. And particular in Maine, the wind resource off of our coast is one of the strongest and most consistent wind resources in the entire world. Like if you look at a global map of wind resources, there's like well, depends on your color scheme, but there's like a dark blue dot on the map that I have in the Gulf of Maine that that's about how fast the wind is blowing and how frequently. So it's really, really important, not just for Maine, but for our whole region. And as we talked about, we have an integrated regional grid. So we kind of either sink or swim together here on all of this. The Trump administration's position on offshore wind and what they've done so far is a massive setback. There's really no way around that. We don't totally know exactly what it will mean for all of the projects that are in the queue. As you might know, there's several projects that are either in various stages of have bought a lease, are under development, have a contract, are under construction in the Mid-Atlantic, the sort of New York Bight, and into southern New England. And I think, each one of those is going to be really interesting to watch. I did see that the owners of the Vineyard Wind project, which is sort of the first large commercial scale project that is under construction, said this week that they expect to finish construction this year. So some of these projects will likely make it to the finish line. But offshore wind for Maine has always been a long-term effort. Vineyard Wind, which is slated to finish construction this year, they bought their lease in 2014, and they pulled their permits back during the first Trump administration, and then put them forward again afterwards and got through permitting and into construction. So while again it's bad news for offshore wind and thus for jobs and economic opportunity for this new industry for Maine, for lowering our exposure to natural gas prices and our dependence on fossil fuels, it's bad news for all of that, but it is not the end of the road for some of these projects. And the offshore wind outlook globally is still really strong. So we can still expect that as this technology matures and develops, especially around floating offshore wind, which is what will be built in the Gulf of Maine because of its depth, that the costs and experience of the industry is going to continue to advance. So I think there's one particular project in Maine that is sort of underway, the Research Array, which is a 10 to 12 turbine array. It's a public-private partnership with the University of Maine and a private developer. That's the furthest along floating project, and probably, if it's constructed, will be the first floating offshore wind project on the U.S. East Coast. And that's something we're really interested in seeing completed. And there's a contract negotiation happening right now at the Public Utilities Commission that we really want to see them conclude successfully, so that project can, keep creeping forward, albeit more slowly than it would have with a administration less hostile to offshore wind, because there's an enormous amount of promise for that industry for Maine, even if it wasn't an industry that was going to address climate change, but it also happens to be like the key to us addressing climate change. So that's why we're really interested in seeing that move forward. I hope that answered the question.
That was outstanding, Jack. Thank you. We have 1 minute left by my clock, and we need to get out of here on time. I do want to do one last question, and maybe I could do this in sort of a, each speaker gets to say one word or sentence, which is, there's a question here about the what's going on in the federal government, and the question is, what should we be lobbying for or against in Congress or against the administration? And so maybe if folks want to just chime in with one sentence or one word about something coming up, and of course, I must say, please join all of our mailing lists and action alert systems. We will keep you on top of the things, state and federal, as they are moving right on time. You can get your comments in the right place. So that'll coming. But if folks want to share sort of one thing that you see on the federal horizon that we should either be supporting or opposing coming up, jump on in, and then I'll turn it over to Maggie to wrap up.
I would say the most important thing is to safeguard democracy.
Amen. Going for the big one.
Okay.
I think working to make sure that the clean energy tax credits are not repealed, and a slightly larger point, hope and encourage Senator Collins to oppose this budget reconciliation bill, which would codify a lot of the damaging cuts that are sort of already being proposed and underway.
Yeah, ditto what Jack said.
I would just say keep on opposing cuts to the Forest Service, Park Service, and as we most recently learned about NOAA.
I do a little twist, and I would say to continue to support the efforts by Maine state officials to push back against the federal efforts, and that includes the AG, it includes Governor Mills, and it includes even Speaker Fecto in pushing back against some of the efforts to try and bring the national partisan nonsense to Maine and the Maine legislature.
Thank you all so much. That was such an incredible way to end. And I know that I'm going to be going into this weekend feeling a lot more positive than when I did when we started. So thank you so much, all of you. And yes, you'll get the follow-up email with all the resources and links to take action and to learn more about all these incredible bills. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.